The boycott of Qatar by fellow Gulf states has intensified after it was issued with 13 demands, including the shutdown of its state broadcaster Al Jazeera. Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Yemen, the United Arab Emirates and Egypt have already applied measures, including expelling Qatari citizens from their territories and banning Qatar Airways from their airspace. They accuse Qatar of funding extremism and destabilising the region. They've reportedly given the state 10 days to comply with the new demands, which also include cutting diplomatic ties with Iran. I'm joined now from central London by Cornelia Meyer, who's an international economist and CEO at Meyer Resources, and Rosemary Hollis, Professor of Middle East Policy Studies at City University. So, Cornelia, first to you. This is really raising the stakes, isn't it?
It's raising the stakes, and you saw that the Foreign Secretary of the United States, Rex Tillerson, came out and said, well, you know, the countries that are boycotting should say what their demands are, but they should be reasonable. And these demands are not reasonable in the sense that, you know, Qatar will have to work with Iran. They share the largest gas field in the world with Iran. So, yes, they can tone down the diplomatic relations somewhat, but not fully. Al Jazeera, that's certainly a no-go for Qatar. They worked very hard to build up Al Jazeera. So from a Qatari point of view, these demands are not reasonable by any stretch of the imagination.
Rosemary Hollis, do you agree? Unreasonable demands?
Absolutely, but what the Saudis want to do is to get Qatar to stop having its own policies on almost anything and to be a subordinate to the kingdom, much like the situation of Bahrain already. And the context includes a more assertive government in Riyadh, exemplified by the recently promoted Mohammed bin Salman, who's now crown prince as opposed to deputy crown prince, and he's the architect of Saudi intervention in Yemen, which has not gone well. He is also the main mouthpiece of an anti-Iranian standing in the region for Saudi Arabia. And on those two counts, he can use Qatar as a target for his frustration, and offering no possibility of the Qataris finding a compromise with Riyadh is dangerous, because the region, and in particular the United States, can ill afford a falling out between two such close allies of Washington.
Go ahead.
If I may come in here, I totally agree with Rosemary. And yes, Mohammed bin Salman has also been a little bit somewhat emboldened by the sort of the presidential visit of President Trump, where they had very strong anti-Iranian rhetoric. And it's more than just not for us for geopolitical stability in the West not being able to afford for GCC to fall out. It's also an economic thing. The GCC have been sort of a beacon of stability in a region torn by war and turmoil. What is happening now is bad also for business. Lots of companies have their regional headquarters in GCC. Some of them even their global headquarters in GCC. So in terms of how the region as a whole and the economic prosperity of GCC is affected, this is not good. Let's not forget there is a very young population, and people need to find jobs for these young people. There's economic policies weaning these countries off the oil and creating employment. For that, they need cooperation, and they need to be seen to be cooperative amongst each other for investment to pour in.
Rosemary, why is Al Jazeera being targeted?
Al Jazeera is outspoken in its criticism of other regimes in the region. It never criticizes the Qatari regime, not surprisingly, because it's owned by the Qataris. But it is critical of other players in the region. And that is a long-standing gripe for the Saudis and the UAE, and indeed for the Egyptians. In addition to that, and the fact that Qatar is reasonably close to Iran compared with the other Arab states, by necessity because of the shared gas field, The other main gripe against Qatar is that amongst the players in the region that they have backed and continue to be friendly with is the Muslim Brotherhood. And if you had to identify an Islamic organization with a massive following around the region that poses a bigger challenge, rivalry to the Saudi regime, you couldn't find one. The Muslim Brotherhood essentially stands for an alternative way of being Sunni Muslim Arab in the region.
So, Cornelia, Qatar now has demands, it has a deadline. What if it doesn't meet either?
Well, it's actually very interesting because when you read the demands, it says, well, there will be divorce. And I guess that means nobody knows what that means. I guess it means throwing Qatar out of GCC. But again, this is not good for the region as a whole, because the West everybody needs a stable GCC, and GCC has to deal, unlike Qatar and the UAE, which have a very small population, the Saudis, the Omanis, they have a young population, they need to find employment for the population. So stability is what does the trick, because investment and business doesn't go where there is instability, it goes where there is stability.
May I mention another danger, though? Because since the United States has its largest air base in the region in Qatar, and of course it has other bases, naval bases, and other forces based around the region, if the United States gets caught up in a scrap between Saudi Arabia and Qatar, because Saudi Arabia, if they wanted to, could just swallow Qatar. The population, national population of Qatar is less than 1 million. They're heavily reliant on foreign workers, and their only land access to the rest of the region is through Saudi Arabia. So they are very much the small player in this. But if the Saudis overplay their hand and swallow up Qatar, or try to engineer a coup d'etat in Qatar, there will be reactions from others in the region, not least Iran itself and the Turks, who have volunteered to help the Qataris in this confrontation. And so the United States could find itself bounced into a much larger and much more dangerous regional conflict or crisis.
You're absolutely right, and I think that's precisely where the US is worried. It has the Al Udeid air base, which is 11,000 Americans are there. All the sorties towards Iraq and Syria are flown out of Al Udeid, but there's also the upside. There's a lot of US investment in Qatar. Let's not forget Exxon has $30 billion tied up in Qatar, and the foreign minister, the foreign secretary, is Rex Tillerson, 10 years the CEO of Exxon. So in that sense, whereas this is very dangerous, there is an upside in that the US will have to do its best to avoid for this to get out of hand.
So the chance of capitulation at this point, do you think?
No, I don't think the list of 13 demands has been put in a way that's helpful to reconciliation. But it was Rex Tillerson, as Cornelia said earlier, who had said, okay, UAE, Saudi Arabia, you want all these changes in Qatar, list them, and then maybe we can start negotiating. Well, there's no way that Qatar could cave in to absolutely all of them, because it would be tantamount to simply surrendering its sovereignty to its much larger neighbor. And therefore, what I think we have to be looking for is some of the items on that list of 13, some room for maneuver, and some talks about, well, how much would be enough to convince the Saudis or oblige the Saudis to say there are more important things to do, and that Qatar will not go out of its way to irritate them, will not be a challenge to them, but it cannot be subordinate. That's what we're looking for.
Rosemary Hollis and Cornelia Meyer, I'm afraid we'll have to leave it there. Thank you both very much.